kind of a question. And prosody was also important. As we saw, you can have a list of questions that has, each one has to be answered separately. What is your name? Where do you live? Who helped you with this, etc., etc. They have a different prosody than, what do you think? Where should we go? There's some sense in which they have to be clubbed together. So even though I have not done as much work on the prosody as needs doing, that's something that other people can do. But I think also now that we are looking at these sorts of structures in relation to each other, why should we have two structures? Do they really, yes, semantically they converge in many cases, but certainly they have different presuppositions maybe, they have different, the status of the embedded, so-called embedded clause or the second clause, or the clause with a contentful WH may have different statuses in the two cases. But how do we know that? Well, then we start looking at discourse. And then we have the syntax semantics pragmatics interface that I think, that I've always felt scope marking had something to say about the pragmatics, and I've given some suggestions about what I think is going on. But an even more interesting way of looking at, of fleshing out the pragmatics, is if it helps us resolve some things that were open in the literature. And so I'm going to I mentioned it yesterday, but I'd like to walk through it a little bit more today, because in the afternoon you'll be working on you'll be having the workshop. And it's always good to work on things that are more or less settled, because nothing is ever fully settled. Things come out when different people look at it, when you look at it from the perspective of different languages. So, the empirical landscape can become richer either by showing the relevance of certain things across more languages, more language types. It can also become important because it can throw light on something that people thought was a universal but is not. And then the challenge is to find a principal way of explaining that variation. Now you will give me 1 minute to put on my jacket because it's cold now. I see I'm not the only one. Vyom comes well prepared, but I have come well prepared too. And it has the added advantage that I can put it in here. Okay, so let's look at the negative island effect. So this is an interesting case because, also the other thing one can always do is not just look at scope marking, but maybe other structures that look similar but may have some differences. And I mentioned the case of WH slifting as one such construction, but there could be other things as well. So the idea behind, so this is a hard fact. Matrix clause can have negation when it's extraction, cannot have negation when it's scope marking. So this was noted. So the example, did I give an example? How silly of me not to give. Okay. So 23A and 23B show that negation cannot be used in, so I'm looking at slide 28. What don't you think? Where should we go? What does nobody think? Where should we go? They both sound pretty like, it's certainly not the way to ask questions of settling the question, where should we go? But the interesting thing is that if you have extraction, so the same thing where, so this is, let's say, TP, you not think, so this would be something like the base, where don't you would do movement, but you think we should go. where don't you think we should go? Completely acceptable question. And Ritzi was the first one who brought this out in relation to German scope marking constructions, that you get negation does not create a problem for movement of this kind, but it does create a problem for scope marking. And he had an explanation that has there were some problems that he treated it in terms of as essentially, see, this could be where, this could be who, it doesn't matter, argument, adjunct, it could be anything, right? But his point was, when you have an expletive here, so this one is okay, but when you have an expletive was, and that is replaced at LF by something from here, this chain is a different kind of chain. It's not an argument chain, because this is an expletive. And therefore negation, it's the same reason why we don't get how many books didn't you read, meaning the kind of question you were asking about. So I've forgotten the details of it, you can look it up. But the point was, in his system, negation created a barrier for this kind of movement. Okay? So this is a syntactic account. It's saying one kind of chain is rooted in a certain relationship between the nodes in the chain. The other one has a different kind of status because it ends in an expletive, or the head is an expletive, something like that. And there have been variants of this over the years, but I would say there's never been a particularly good explanation for it. So I consider it an open question. Also, remember that we're dealing with sequential scope marking now. So any explanation that is really tied to chain formation of this kind is not quite easy to push. Again, the reason I hesitate to say this is because I don't know, maybe there's a way to make it work in the syntax. I don't see how it would be done, but that is not to say it's not possible. But I think sequential scope marking is a real issue for syntactic accounts of direct dependency. At any rate, if you're not going to do direct dependency, how do you explain this fact in the indirect dependency approach? And of course, since I've been working on this for the last 20-something years, I worked at it on it intermittently. I have thought about negation and I have thought of explaining it in certain ways. But as I said, that my thinking on this topic has changed in the last, the pragmatics of it has changed in the last few months. And so now I think the negative island effect may have its source in this idea that the first, this question, the question Q1, is a way of settling Q2. It should help you resolve Q2, right? That's what the idea that I'm pursuing. And from that perspective, someone's positive thoughts, what they think about something, if I accept their view, can help resolve it. But what you don't think doesn't really help. So this is a kind of pragmatic explanation for the negative island effect. But I also have a couple of other arguments showing that this is not a negative island effect. And I'll just present it again, the issues that are a little bit, the explanations for these things you'll have to go and read. Again, they are discussed in my book, but then you have to follow the lead to the original articles to fully appreciate it. Okay, so here's one fact, this I owe to Gennaro Kirchhoff for pointing out why this way in which I'm looking at another reason why it's not a negative island effect. So one thing that has been noted, so you say, how much doesn't he weigh? That's a bad question. You can tell me how much he weighs. If he weighs 60 kilos, then he doesn't weigh 61, he doesn't weigh 62, what is the number that you're going to give me? There's some reason why this is bad. However, this was noted by, I forget, Kuhn. Anyway, Fox and Hackle have worked on it, but the observation is due to someone else. How much isn't he allowed to weigh? So let's say you're on the team it's only open to people under a certain weight, right? And then you have, because you're sort of setting the parameters of competition. And now you can ask a negative question, how much isn't he allowed to weigh, once you have this modal in there. And what he pointed out to me was that you can't do the same with scope marking. What aren't you allowed to believe? Who should be the next president? It's still as bad. So, let's say if you were, if you're going to have elections, we are in 2020 or we were in 2016 in America, before November, you could say, what do you believe? Who should be the next president? Or even now we can ask about the future, right? Who should be the next president? And certainly some of us may be controlled by other people. We are not free to express our opinion or whatever would make it possible to say, what aren't you allowed to believe? So what I'm trying to say is, there could be a way to make this meaning, like you could think about having these kinds of modals, etc., but it doesn't add up to a good scope marking structure, because propositions that you're not allowed to believe or that you don't believe, none of them help you settle the question of who should be the next president, right? That's what we are discussing. So this is an argument that we really aren't looking at the same phenomenon. So in doing these analyses, of course, whenever we need to think about, we need to describe a phenomenon in terms of known properties of different other constructions. And how you classify, how you articulate the problem, in a way determines how you think about it. And then there are explanations that you look for. So if you think about it as a negative island effect, then you will think about all the issues or proposals that are there for negative islands. And in some sense, that's what I was doing earlier, trying to look for alternatives to a syntactic account of negative island. But maybe this is not a negative island effect at all, and so that this is one further argument for that. And then there's another one, which is that the set of quantifiers is not restricted. The things that are okay and not okay don't divide along the line of what is negative and could be classified as positive, negative, or something, whatever way you want to think of it. So everyone is certainly good. I think most is not so bad either. What's your opinion of 25b? You can think of a context where you would use that, right? And certainly 26a is not good, but that's a negative island effect. But I think it's also odd that what do a few people think? Like, it doesn't seem quite to the point to me. Do you share that? What do a few people think? So, it's like a minority view isn't really the view that we would. So this is a kind of a pragmatic explanation for this effect, for something that looks very syntactically, right? Like, looks like a grammaticality. Yes. Yeah.
What if instead of few or few, we give something definite but in minority? Like, what do those few people think?
Okay, so that
seems quite acceptable.
And what are those few people? So what's the flesh it out?
So if we are still talking about minority, but if we definite, what do those few people?
And are those few people very are their views important? They're just any random few people?
Or even if you put something like, what does the minority think? Where should we go? It still sounds quite acceptable question.
Does it?
But the introduction of those it seems that those few people have already been referred to by a prior context.
True. So that's the either prior context or by pointing, right? So that's what the demonstrative gives you. But I think your point is that it's still a minority, but what's different between, having just random few people or those few? Are those few people, so let's say we have the whole group here, we're thinking about where should we go. When would we use those two people at the back, let's say. I just randomly picked the two that are least visible, maybe not you, those two. When would I ask this question? I'm not challenging you, I'm just trying to see what they are definitely. I'm just pointing to those two there.
When you don't want to leave out.
You don't want to leave them out. So that could be, yes.
Doesn't the very fact that you're pointing towards somebody bring in some sort of salience to the very
True.
population that you're referring to?
But I think the point that is at issue is the view important or not important in settling the question? Or is it that I want everybody's opinion and I've already collected, 95% is known and now those too few people are left? Is that what's going on?
It might not be that they're important, but it's just that they're left out.
And that won't happen with a sum because it's arbitrary any two. So, this is not something I had thought of before. So this is the kind of thing that, when you start thinking in these terms, it gets refined. And we will think about this, but so can you, but this can be, it can either refine a current, the line of thinking that I'm presenting, or it can challenge it and it will still refine it, of course. But whether it says you have to change something in what you have or just supplement it, that's the issue. So but everybody agrees with this, that I could say, but mind you, that can only be done after we have already surveyed the rest, right? Not out of the blue. And maybe that's the difference, that when I say those few, it presupposes that I have enough, but I still want to, before I make my decision, before we decide let's also complete the picture. Whether it's that, which is not what you would get with what do some people think, because maybe I don't have anyone's opinion yet. So that may be the key factor, but it's like judgments of anything. When you're standing up in front of an audience, you have judgments you want to think when you go home also. Yes, Srikar.
I'm not so sure about, say, surveying the rest of the place and then they being left out.
Mm-hmm.
Even when you, say, start off discussing where
Okay.
you want to go, you can just ask, they don't seem interested, for example.
Mm-hmm.
What do those people think? Where should we go? So even if they're the first people we are taking opinions on,
We don't know anybody else's.
yeah, even then it seems fine.
Okay.
But there's still even that sort of factors in on the notion that there's some salience where we are separating them out from a group as opposed to just saying a few, which could be any handful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in some sense, you're restricting the question to, it's like saying, what does John think?
Yeah.
So maybe you're not really doing full quantification in that sense. Praveen? Yeah.
I do not know whether this is my reading or the others too can get this, but when you move from few, etc., and towards those few, or
Mm-hmm.
I think you're moving from sort of definitely negative, because few is how we treat it, and then as you move closer, because even in few and a few, I see that my own intuitions about the sentence
Shift a little bit.
shift a little bit.
Yeah.
So maybe
Yeah.
there's a climb of,
Yeah.
I don't know whether to use the word climb, but if there's a scale of negativity or a degree of negativity that can be associated to these.
So I agree with you that there's some climb of something. I don't know that it's negativity, because a few is not negative, right? It does not, yeah. So it's got to be, so those may have this, making them salient and saying that is it's equivalent of let's disregard others, let's look at this set, which then becomes more or less like proper names. But if there's a difference between few and a few, and I also get some sense, it cannot be on negative versus not, right?
It could be a set. I mean, so in the case of those few, you definitely have a fixed set.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Their few is only playing the role of it's a small number.
yeah.
It's, yeah.
And in these two, at least, you know that, okay, I cannot even
Mm-hmm.
point out to something.
Yes.
In a few, I definitely have something in mind.
Oh,
So,
so there are 2 or 3 things here that need to be factored in if we look closer. It's true that definites, including demonstratives, work, maybe with whatever we are saying in the discourse that raises the salience. Maybe we are setting aside the bigger question and asking the smaller question of these few people. But there's also this issue of whether, when we have these other kind of quantifiers, whether A, negative, yes, definitely, and we should look at other, I'm trying to think, okay. But we also want to definitely think about the distinction between non-specific and specific tree. I think that's what you were getting at. And so everyone is aware of this difference between specific indefinite and non-specific indefinite. If a relative of mine dies, everybody is sure. Now let me just write it. So, if this is not a nice example. I'm going to change it just a little bit to make it easier to understand. I'll inherit a house, let's say. And let's assume you have only 3 or 4 relatives. Under what conditions will you inherit a house? However many I have, all of them have to die, and how many houses will you get? 1 per house, right? Okay. So that is the narrow scope reading. So this is an island, huh? So this is the if clause. I'll just do it this way. This says all x, relative x, and die x, then I inherit, and I'll write 1 house. Okay. This is the narrow scope reading. We already said every text quantifier scope is local, right? So this is within this TP, this is the if clause, and this is the then clause. So if every relative of mine dies, I did local scope, and if that happens, then this happens. Yeah? This is scope here. Okay, I inherit 1 house. So does it have a reading where it has non-local scope? We already primed ourselves to thinking that it won't. What would the non-local scope be like? You can see all this now, right? Because of that lovely technology we have, right? Everyone sees it. This would say x die x, then inherit I inherit 1 house. And now this is a non-local scope. This will say every x such that x is a relative of mine. This says for every x, if x is such that x is my relative, if x dies, I inherit a house. How many houses? First of all, now let's say we live in a reasonable world. 1 of my relatives dies. There are other issues here, but at least this one. Let's assume I have relatives and 1 of them dies. In 2018, I'll get 1 house. Then 2019, the second one dies, I'll get the second house. Then 2020, I'm done with all my relatives. I have 3 houses, and then I die and I don't get to use any of the houses. But that's a tragedy. That's a sad story then. But my point is, do we have this reading where I'm going to get 3 houses if everything goes well and they all die one by one?
I don't think so.
No, right? And that tells you again what we were discussing earlier, that QR is local. So it can only take scope right here. Everyone dies, then whatever. So this is This is showing you that you only get local scope. Quantifiers have local scope. Okay. This is for every. Every is a nice quantifier. But now, I say, if 3 relatives of mine die, I'll inherit a house. This has one reading, I have lots of relatives, but any 3 die, I'll get a house. But we all have relatives, they don't all love me. But there are 3, they own a house together, and I'm in their will, right? I have 3 particular relatives in mind. So the idea is it has one reading where what I'm saying, I could be wrong, but what I'm saying, local scope, any group of 3 relatives of mine dies, I'll get a house. That's the narrow scope, local. And just like other quantifiers, it can take local scope, and that's fine. But indefinites also have a second reading. Some people say they're ambiguous, there are various ways to derive it. We're not concerned with that here. But just because this issue came up in relation to what we were discussing, maybe this becomes very close to something like a deictic reading where you may not know who I'm talking about, but you know that I have in mind, Uncle A, Aunt B, and Cousin C. Those 3 die, so it's almost like it's a demonstrative. The only difference is that when I use a regular demonstrative, I expect everyone to know who I'm talking about. So normal definites, normal indefinite demonstratives are known to speaker and hearer. They're part of the common ground. Specific indefinites, at least linguistically, have the property that the hearer, it shouldn't be obvious, it should be clear that I have in mind someone specific. But who that person is should not be already clear to everybody. So I wouldn't point to somebody and use an indefinite. So I think what Praveen was saying when he was talking about some cases of an indefinite that may license this, it's possible, again I haven't looked closely, we would have to run various tests, that what we are really talking about are specific indefinites, maybe they license it, but again these are all things that need to be looked at, but that's not a negative island effect, right? If they're improving with specificity, etc., we are really not talking about, one could still argue if one really wanted to, but I don't think so. I think the fact that the non-specific indefinite is not good tells you that it's not a negative island. You would have to run the test to see whether those non-specific indefinites block extraction in the same way that negation does. And as far as I remember, they don't. Okay? So this is one aspect of scope marking that is still open. The other one that is definitely open is predicate restrictions, and I want to bring this up because this is really something where work can be, there's scope for work. Okay. So before I present this, I'm going to tell you that my current way of thinking actually doesn't work for Hindi. It works very nicely for German and English, unless somehow we have misconstrued the facts. Okay, so let me just walk through the list and then you'll see. So, predicate restrictions. So what has the witness admitted? Who asked her to lie? So this is good. So I took these words from Martha Rice's work on scope marking, where she discusses certain class of verbs that are good in scope. So I'm on 34, slide 34. Okay, so what has the witness admitted? Who asked her to lie? We are trying to find out who got the, so if the witness admitted something, again, that's a way of settling the question. So that's the idea I'm playing out. So admit is good, and actually there's this work by Cattell on volunteer stance versus response stance verbs that I think kind of play a role here, but you can read on that. But basically a volunteer stance is something where the person has a response to volunteers. So claim is volunteer stance. Say can be volunteer stance, whereas deny is response stance, right? You say something and I deny it. So there's but he classifies verbs. There's some very interesting fine distinctions. So believe can be both. If you believe, if someone says to you something and you believe that story, the source is someone else and you believe it, that's kind of a response stance. But also I have my own beliefs about things, and that's a volunteer stance. He wasn't looking at scope marking, he was looking at extraction actually, and he argues for this role of this distinction, and I think something like that plays out here. So 32A is good, but 33A, what is the witness denying? Who asked her to lie? Is kind of hard to think. I mean, they don't sound ungrammatical, but they're kind of, what are you getting at? And I think that's again, because if I deny something, I haven't really helped solve, even if I'm a good authority, it doesn't help me with the point of view. So that's sort of the idea I'm saying. So, and it so happens that deny is a response stance verb. Then there are this class, again this is from Rice. What does Jane regret? Who did she talk to? This also sounds bad, and she rules out regret from this class. So these are known as, I think, strong factive verbs. So factive verbs presuppose an answer, presuppose the truth of the complement. On top of that, regret adds this attitude. And so I think that Hindi, I don't know, how would you translate regret? खेद है or something like that. अफसोस है. तुमको किस बात का अफसोस है? कौन आया था? So I think probably regret and अफसोस होना, Hindi will probably agree with this. So, but here's a factive word that does allow. So what has Jane discovered? Who did Mary talk to? Okay. And this one I think is interesting because in one sense it is a factive verb. So we can't just say factive verbs, the scope marking doesn't accept factive verbs because discourse, although that too is a little bit at issue, but basically there's a sense in which you discovered a fact, right? You don't discover non-facts, so to say, right? But if you think about this, when would you ask this? What has Jane discovered? Who did Mary talk to? One context in which I think this is good is when we have been wondering who Mary talked to, and you say, well, let's ask Jane, she might have discovered some. So, and you go and ask Jane, and you come back and I can say, so what did Jane discover? Who did Mary talk to? So it still presupposes, it satisfies the presupposition that there's a point in the discourse when the answer to Q2 was not settled. But now it has been settled by someone and you're asking, or I can even say, what have you discovered? But earlier we were maybe still wondering about Q2, and it's okay, let's go and look at our, let's do some more investigative work and then we'll get back at 12 and discuss this. And in that context I can say, so what have you discovered? Who did Mary talk to? And it's accepted. So it's not factive, non-factive, but so I'm of course pushing this idea that it's got to be things that at one point were not known but is now known. And okay, so why do I think this is an issue? Because if you look at the literature, I forget now whether scope marking was discussed by Mahajan or not, but certainly me and Utpal, I think Anupal, of course Mahajan also, I think all of us had examples with factive verbs. So I don't know how this idea that Q2 is not settled plays out there. Like I said, I was looking at English, but I would be interested to see what the range of verbs is. It just think, believe, say, these are all volunteer stance verbs that everybody will, I expect, will be completely acceptable in all of our languages. To what extent you can get something like regret, to what extent you can get something like तुम्हें क्या पता चला, what will we say for discover? तुम्हें क्या पता चला, something like that. I expect that will be okay. तुम्हें क्या मालूम है? I don't know if that is, now my intuitions are very, I would have to sit down and really think, but I know that we had examples like that. Ravi क्या जानता है? And then I have to think again how exactly that, plays into this. So these are some of the things that you might think about in doing, your work this afternoon. Any questions before we move on to something else? Yeah.
Few things,
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to know a little bit more.
Well, let's ask. So this is again in the negative. What do at least a few people think? Where should we go? Or, it will work better with a yes-no question. What do at least a few people think? Should we do this? That is much better because, again, I'm thinking of a context where, there's a lot of disagreement. It's unclear. And people not giving clear, responses to this. So, okay, let at least a few people, at least more than 5 people. Again, that would be consistent with this idea that, ideal would be if everybody agreed on something or gave a, but at least more than one person should have this idea, right? So at least a small majority. So that's also, to the extent that I think that is acceptable, right? At least 5. Yes, Srikar.
So, are we trying to base this difference between most and few on the idea that we would all like everyone to agree on a particular stand?
Uh-huh.
But what if, say, let's assume I'm of the opinion that anything a majority holds is wrong, we shouldn't do it. So, I mean,
Yes.
in that case, it should be possible that, my judgments are otherwise, right?
That you want
Yeah.
a few to be good, but not most.
If we think this is the reason.
Yeah.
So could you then use the comparative and say what do fewer people think or that
Yeah,
will
Mhm.
clear.
Yeah, because few probably is the minority, but it doesn't cue us into that. So that's a good question. But so one interesting point is that to the extent that these things are variable, we are saying it's really pragmatically conditioned, right? So you have to think of a contrarian who really wants to promote the minority view in order to make sense of asking. So the way for that person or that context, in that context, the way to settle Q2 is the minority view, not the majority view. So I think all of this is really saying, see, syntax is about structure, right? And few, let's say, even if whatever properties you want to give to few or fewer, it's not going to change because the personality of the person asking the question is different or their philosophy of life is different, right? That's a syntactic change. Or even pure semantics can't, because you decide what are the properties of this quantifier versus that quantifier. But if you're really thinking as a pragmatic explanation of these facts, then this kind of shiftiness is what you would expect. Yeah, Praveen?
Yep, no, I was just trying to process this because what Renuka says makes sense. If we were to go by what Srikar said, I think fewer would fit in, but still few would not.
Few would not, yeah. And
There's something about few that still, makes it sort of, I cannot process this.
Yeah. Yeah, because again, I'm not sure that I'm not trying to give answers. I'm really trying to think about, we have this intuition that, okay, we can think about a situation like that. Why is fewer better than few? And these are all topics to, get started on. But clearly the comparative helps us think of that situation, or that situation invites, sometimes you have to think of what are the alternatives. Alternatives to few can be many, most, etc., like a whole range, whereas fewer and more, right? Fewer has only one alternative maybe, and that's what that particular context invites. So there could be, it's a complex interaction between different things. Again, in all of this, semantics and syntax are still important. Syntax is telling us that it cannot be, the structure does not change by the choice of different, or even the nature of the chain doesn't change if you have the same type of quantifier, right? But then pragmatics is playing a role, and I guess what we would want to double check is that these things are not affected when you have extraction, right? So.
Because I would think
Mhm.
it would make sense if I have already gotten an answer to what does everyone think, and then I want to take a step back from there. But few doesn't have that background, which is why fewer.
Sounds better.
Yes, because
Like not
does even many sound okay here? What do many people do?
Maybe not. To me, most seem good. Yeah.
Definitely.
So lots of issues that. So you didn't come here to just learn, right? You came here to. Some people were looking for topics. Some people, and that's why I'm actually, even when you present stuff that you completely thought you had covered, nailed, if you present to a group that is awake and alive, it reopens things. But this is, of course, I expected this, because you may be the second or the third group that I have presented this idea to, and one of those groups didn't have time to, they had like half an hour to ask questions, and there were several different questions. So yeah, so this is kind of neat that there's, so I hope I remember. It's all taped, right? So that's one advantage. I can go back and look at it, listen to it and get the, yes, Praveen, one, sorry.
You said sound doesn't fit well.
I thought it doesn't, but I just,
Because what I was trying to get is if you put some of you, then it again sounds okay. So maybe most, fewer, some of you, what they are doing is trying to, restrict the domain and then.
Yeah.
So
So is there a set or a subset coming into play here? Because when you did the at least a few, this is okay.
yeah,
When
yeah.
you do some of you, it's again okay. In the case of many, you don't get a.
Many of you, yeah,
When you say many of you,
Mhm.
then again what you're doing is you're specifying the whole set,
yeah,
out of which you're extracting a subset. So,
and that works. What do many of you think? It's not. Most is good, but what do many of you think? Again, I guess you can make it work if you, I suppose, with some, but not so straightforwardly. So let's move on to the next topic. We have till 1 o'clock, right? So here's what I'm thinking of, just because you people are wondering where is this class going, every day there's a new thing or whatever. I actually don't know where exactly it's going, but here are some things that I want to discuss, and this is the way now I'm separated. It's not going to follow the handout exactly. We have been discussing more WH questions by and large, right? So there's one other thing, the delinking idea that has to do with WH questions. So I think I'll introduce that, complete it tomorrow, and then I want to focus a little more next week on polar questions and Q particles that go with polar questions. And therefore, I'm going to wait on there's still the left periphery handout I have not completed. I will come back to it. But I think I'm going to go to the delinking handout that you have. It also, you will find in a slightly different context, this idea of some of you, three of you, you'll see there's some resonance to that. So everyone ready to take a to shift gears a little bit. Okay, let me erase that. How many of you have heard the term delinking? No? Okay, that's interesting. So this is actually based on something in prep, but also there's a, like I said, I mentioned to someone, I gave a talk that is videotaped, so in case anybody, I think I got most of that stuff here because I wrote this up after I gave the talk. And it was the first time I thought, this taping thing is worth it, because otherwise it's like, I prefer not to be taped because you can say whatever you want and without worrying about someone, listening in. What if you make a mistake? Because of course you make mistakes. But then it was really, really useful to listen to the questions actually, because you usually have your handout, right, or your slides or whatever, so you know what you said or what you wanted to say or whatever. But the questions, there were a couple of them that I had forgotten that were actually quite useful. So I'm glad now that this is being taped. Every cloud has a silver lining. So that's the silver lining with taping, is that you can recreate the discussion. That, like this discussion, if you ask me 2 hours later, I'll forget what people were saying, but at least it's on record. Okay, so delinking and discourse. So this is a term that's used quite commonly in syntactic literature, and basically D stands for discourse. So in that sense, it fits in with what we are trying to do, which we are talking about the interfaces. So that's crucially discourse. This is another case where things that look very syntactic, grammaticality, ungrammaticality, those are syntactic judgments, but they're cute to pragmatics, but in a funny way. So you'll see what. So the term goes back to Pisetsky, and he distinguishes between two types of covert mechanisms available to WH expressions. Basically, he says that delinked WHs. So a WH expression, we've been, studying them. He is on board with that, some such way of interpreting WH expressions. But he says there's got to be a second way. And that second way is only open to, so the first way of interpreting WH expressions is, let's say, through movement. And movement is syntax compliant, because movement, that's what syntactic theory is about. Therefore, it must obey islands, for example. But there has to be a second way of interpreting WH expressions in natural language, and that second way does not care about, so there are two properties. It's discourse linked, and we'll see what that means, and it doesn't care about islands. Okay, so this is giving discourse a certain syntactic status. So the relevant notion of discourse that was assumed is that he says is familiarity of the set quantified over by the WH expression. So this is what when we were bringing in all these participes, some of you, some of them, some of the, a partitive has an inner definite NP, right? So you can't say some of two boys, two of three. You can say two of three boys, but never mind about that. So the core kind of partitive has an inner definite DP. So, and that's what he talks about. Familiarity of the set quantified over by the WH expression. He argues for the crucial role of this relation to discourse in the classification of WH phrases. That's one. So he uses it for that. Second, for the amelioration of superiority. Superiority effects actually don't have as much relevance in our languages, which typically don't have standard WH fronting. I'll just show you the what it is, but I don't want to discuss it in this course. And the third one, covert scope taking, which we have been talking about. Okay, so we will primarily focus on the first, but just touch upon the other two today or tomorrow, then we'll see how far we get. Okay, so the question that it raises is, what's the relationship between morphosyntax and semantics of three types of WH phrases that he looks at? He looks at he looks at which and who and what. So complex and monomorphemic. So which, book, man, author, whatever. And then you have DPs like, which are intransitive Ds maybe. Who, what, when, where. So of course there's some specification, right? Who is for animates, what is for inanimates. But syntactically they're different. And his point is that these ones are delinked, inherently delinked. So inherently delinked are things like which and. Not inherently delinked are these, who, what, etc. But they can get delinked in certain contexts. Okay, all of the monomorphemic ones. And then actually I don't know if there's one in Hindi of this type, then which is in English WH the hell. Usually you don't get the, I don't know what this is, the hell. So you say, who the hell told you to work on this? What the hell have you done? Where the hell did she go? So almost, why the hell would you do that? I think all of the WHs lend themselves to the hell. And he says those are inherently non-delinked. Is that what I wrote? Yeah. Is there something in Hindi that you have never thought about it? Japanese has itai, so I think there is one, but I'm not going to be too much concerned with that. These are the two that I want. What's intense discussion?
We were thinking about putting a which in place of WS, which the hell book says.
You can't do it.
The book would be a delinkable thing and this is inherently delinked, so it.
That's why it doesn't. Yeah, that's why it would be ungrammatical to say which the hell, or the other way. That is definitely one reason why people would say you can only do it with monomorphemics. But so I'm not looking at that. I'm really looking at these two. So what is it in the syntax of this versus this, or in the semantics that they should have these properties about scope taking, etc. Nothing in what we have said so far, the way in which we have analyzed it, really says this is better than that, because of course who also in a context we don't just mean any human being, we typically have domain restrictions. So anyway, so that's what we're going to look at, what this says. So yeah, and within the class of delinkable, there's a line between who and what. They very easily